Tanse. My name is Clayton Kootenay. I'm from Alexander First Nation, which is just over there. What you haven't seen in my bio is I'm married to Jody Kootenay, and I'm a proud father of 3 beautiful children, Daniel, Mackenzie, and Sierra. And I'm very honored to be here today. And I'd like to thank Ida Bull for the opening prayer. Obviously, Grand Chief Bernice Marshall for being here, and his worship mayor, Don Iverson. I want to give you a little bit of a different perspective, a First Nations education perspective. Things must change. I'm going to talk a little bit about the treaty relationship, residential schools, band-operated schools, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work I'm doing on the Memorandum of Understanding for First Nations education here in Alberta. And I want to talk a little bit about the Indigenous Knowledge and Wisdom Center. Treaty relationships. A treaty is an agreement under international law entered into by actors in international law, namely sovereign states and international organizations. Here are some examples of treaty. The North American Free Trade Agreement, the NAFTA agreement, is an agreement signed between Canada and the United States of America and Mexico. Signed in 1992 and came into force in effect on January 1st, 1994. The Canada-China Income Tax Agreement between Government of Canada and the Government of the People's Republic of China, signed on May 12, 1986. Another example of treaty, Treaty Number 6, signed in 1876 in Fort Carlton and Pitt. The treaty First Nations agreed to live in peace and coexistence with other peoples, with respect to and without interference in one another's laws, governments, and ways of life. Often referred to as the peace treaties, 11 historical treaties were negotiated in most parts of the Prairie provinces. These treaties were meant to have First Nations, Métis, Inuit peoples, and settlers live in harmony. These treaties are to last as long as the sun shines, the rivers flow, and the grasses grow. There are 48 First Nations and 140 reserves in the province of Alberta, covering 3 treaty areas. Treaty Number 6, I mentioned, Treaty Number 7, and Treaty Number 8. Treaties are about a relationship, about a responsibility. We both have responsibilities to live up to in these agreements. We are both at fault at times for not living up to these responsibilities. Who pays the price ultimately is our children and the future generations. We need to find a way to get along and to work with one another. I want to talk a little bit about the residential schools. Between 1831 and 1969, residential schools operated in Canada through arrangements between the Government of Canada and the Church. One common objective defined this period: the assimilation of Aboriginal children. Over 130 residential schools were located across the country, with the last one closing in 1996. More than 150,000 First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children were taken from families and placed in these schools. Many were forbidden to speak their language and practice their own culture. Many were forbidden to speak their own language and to practice their own culture. Today, there are an estimated 80,000 former students still living today. While some former students have positive experiences at residential schools, many suffered emotional, physical, sexual abuse, and others died while attending these schools. The unsolved trauma suffered by former students has been passed on from generation to generation, and it's going to take 7 generations for us to get out of this darkness. On June 11th, 2008, the Prime Minister on behalf of the Government of Canada, issued an apology in the House of Commons to former students, their families, and communities. The apology is considered by many a step towards reconciliation. A little bit of light. It's not, my speech is not all bleak. I want to talk a little bit about band-operated schools. The band-operated schools were born out of necessity, as the federally run schools of the 1960s and 70s was a disservice to our people. Due largely in part of a reaction to the 1969 White Paper and its assimilation policies, First Nations rebutted with the Red Paper, led by Dr. Harold Cardinal, and later the Indian Control of Indian Education Policy Paper of 1972. There are currently 58 band-operated schools in Alberta. Most band-operated schools became fully autonomous in the 1980s, funded by the Government of Canada. Most band-operated schools have been chronically underfunded for many decades. In Canada, there are two systems of education: the provincial system and the First Nations band-operated school. Approximately 10,000 First Nations students attend band-operated schools. An additional 6,500 living on territory attend provincial schools through a tuition agreement. There are approximately 40,000 First Nations Métis Inuit students that have self-identified who attend provincial schools throughout the province of Alberta, most of which are urban. My youngest daughter attends a band-operated school. My oldest daughter attends a provincial-run school. And my wife is the Director of Education at our band-operated school, which you see here, Kootenay Education Centre. On reserve, we reach a glass ceiling. We've been chronically underfunded, but there's some light at the end of the tunnel. The work that I do is on the MOU. On February 24th, 2010, the Grand Chiefs of Treaty Number 6, 7, and 8 signed a Memorandum of Understanding for First Nations education in Alberta. And I was lucky to be a part of this. I've been a part of this work for a while. The concept of the partnership is at the heart of the MOU. Why the MOU? Because of low graduation rates, student achievement rates, funding, and the loss of language and culture. All parties have a collective stake in improving First Nations success. The MOU is one of the most comprehensive First Nations education MOUs in Canada. There are several commitments in the MOU, but for the purposes of my presentation, I want to focus on the light. I want to talk a little bit about the Indigenous Knowledge and Wisdom Centre. It's not a new idea. The idea was borrowed from the Indian Control of Indian Education Policy Paper, 1972. It was called the Cultural Education Centre, whereby the centre would promote studies of Indian history, culture, language, and values. The idea of a cultural education centre would have certainly been lost if it was not for Miss Marilyn Buffalo and for Mr. Lewis Cardinal, who insisted on the idea that the Cultural Education Centre was to be included in the Education MOU. The centre, which you see here, is to be a centre of expertise for First Nations language and culture, support curriculum resource development, a stewardship for First Nations research and data, collaborative and federal provincial governments would work together, provide supports for First Nations education authorities, and provide professional development for teachers. Finally, we'll see the IKWC become a reality. We'll stop talking about doing something. This is Queen Mary Park School, located here in Edmonton. And we're able to take and start working out of this office at the end of June of this year. My vision is to see something like one of our architects could designed for us. I'll show you a concept of what I envision possibly for an Indigenous Knowledge and Wisdom Center here in the great city of Edmonton. The work would not have been achieved without the support of a partnership which was forged on our tables. The MOU working group table, the Chiefs table on First Nations education, the education circle, and the elected officials table. This work is all about people and our relationships with one another. But more importantly, it's about our children, our grandchildren, and our great-grandchildren. Our forefathers could see this into the future. Let's learn from our past and let's walk into the future together. I don't want to leave a mess for my children to clean up. We can do this, but it can't be done in isolation. We need to work together, and I need your help. Let's not lose another generation. In the words of Chief Sitting Bull, let's put our minds together to see what we can do for our children, regardless of where we live. Thank you very much. Hi, hi.